They're just waiting for that final nod from the government, and that nod, of course, later in the story we tell you that hasn't come through because of sheer red tape on the government's part. But Jio, of course, is not alone. The ministry, there's been radio silence at the ministry's end. It's been 5 years since the government, the Education Ministry, specifically launched a scheme called the Institution of Eminence scheme. It was launched with much fanfare. It's one of those few education schemes that around that time the Prime Minister had often referred to in his speeches.
ये जो यूनिवर्सिटी टॉप 10 आएगी 20 टोटल, उनको सरकार के नियमों बंधनों से मुक्त करके एक स्वतंत्रता दी जाएगी। उनको जिस दिशा में जैसे आगे बढ़ना है बढ़ने के लिए अवसर दिया जाएगा, और इस काम के लिए 5 साल के भीतर इन यूनिवर्सिटी को 10,000 करोड़ रुपए 10,000 करोड़ रुपया दिया जाएगा।
The objective of this scheme was to essentially give unprecedented freedoms and autonomy to 20 selected institutions, 10 government and 10 private institutions. That was the breakup. And give them freedom, rather to empower them to achieve world-class status.
Today we will be selecting 20 Institute of Eminence which will become world-class in next 10 years. और इसमें सरकारी संस्थाओं पर हर संस्था को 1,000 करोड़ रुपए एक्स्ट्रा सरकार देगी.
The rationale behind that was that Indian institutions weren't doing really well in the international rankings per se, so the government felt that, with more academic freedom, with more freedom in administrative and financial matters, these institutions, at least these 20, would be empowered to do well internationally on a global ranking scale. We thought it would be interesting to just see what the government's track record has been in as far as promising autonomy to these just 20 institutions are concerned. So that was the objective of the investigation, to do a status check to see how has it been implemented, whether the government has actually come good on its promise of giving autonomy and cutting red tape, and whether the institutions in turn have really benefited from the IOE status in any way. We have essentially focused on the Jio Institute in the first part. Like I mentioned earlier, that there was this controversy over its selection. And but having said that, Jio and what's happening at Jio Institute or with Jio Institute is representative of what's maybe going wrong with the scheme. That on ground, after all, the government hasn't managed to empower these institutions at all. All of the autonomy promised is technically still on paper. So what's happened is that even 5 years down the line, just 12 out of the 20 which were selected for this status were actually notified. But Jio, of course, is not alone. There are at least 3 other private institutions, which is Vellore Institute of Technology, Amrita Vishwa Vidyapeetham, and Kalinga Institute. These are another 3 which have had their proposals greenlit. All formalities, all checks, everything has been cleared. But at this point, they're just waiting for that final nod from the government. And that nod, of course, later in the story we tell you that hasn't come through because of sheer red tape on the government's part. There was a committee that was supposed to clear these final proposals. It finished its term 2 years back, and no one from the government has notified that committee yet. The ministry, there's been radio silence at the ministry's end, specifically to the question about why is it that they haven't managed to notify the empowered expert committee, that crucial committee which is meant to sort of, like I said, cut red tape for these IOEs. Why has that committee been defunct for 2 years? So there's absolutely no response to that. As of now, as far as the government's concerned, in the last 3 years, there's barely been any announcement, any press release from the government on the status of the scheme. Just a few, responses in Parliament. And they haven't really said why they haven't notified the EC scheme. So they've virtually been silent on the IOE scheme after the announcement of those 20 institutions selected for the status.